U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading back to Washington after a Middle East tour aimed at consolidating a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Mr. Blinken was in Jordan for the last leg of his visit. Before that, he met President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, which mediated the latest truce. Mr. Blinken also met both Israeli and Palestinian leaders. He's promised millions of dollars in aid to rebuild Gaza. At the same time, he's reiterated that Israel has the right to defend itself from attacks by Hamas.
Securing the ceasefire was important, particularly because of the devastating toll violence took on families on both sides. But we see the ceasefire not as an end, but as a beginning, something to build on.
Simon Marks joins us from Washington, D.C. for more on this. Simon, how much headway has Antony Blinken made in wider peace negotiations?
I think there's very little expectation among foreign policy analysts here in Washington, D.C., Steve, that he's made much headway in that regard for a couple of different reasons. I mean, first of all, the topography of the situation has not changed. The Secretary of State did indeed meet with Palestinian officials, but only those from Mahmoud Abbas's inner circle in Ramallah in the West Bank. There is no communication whatsoever between the United States and Hamas, deemed as it is a terrorist organization by the US, the European Union and the State of Israel. But also in broader terms, the Biden administration has made it very clear that it doesn't really want to focus in a meaningful way on the situation in the Middle East. It hasn't presented its own peace proposals for the region. It still doesn't have a US ambassador to Israel in place. It doesn't have a senior figure at the State Department overseeing the Middle East portfolio. It's been very dismissive of the Abraham Accords that were signed and sealed under the aegis of former President Donald Trump a few months ago, but hasn't offered yet proposals for how to take things further. So the concrete achievement of Antony Blinken's trip is cementing the ceasefire in place, and there's no question that there are sighs of relief here in Washington that a week later it is still holding. But in terms of the broader long-term outlook, still very difficult to see very much progress in that regard.
What about the issue of sort of rebuilding Gaza and funds being sent in that direction? Are Palestinians, can they expect to receive help from the US?
Well, there definitely will be help coming. I mean, we know $5.5 million in emergency aid that the United States immediately hopes to send to Gaza, largely through the offices of the United Nations. Then there's talk of another $35 million that will be sent through the United Nations Works Relief Agency. But the US has made it absolutely clear that it doesn't want any of that aid, any of those supplies falling into the hands of Hamas, because the Biden administration is under congressional pressure over the millions and billions of dollars that over the years the United States has spent arming Israel. Then there's violence. Gaza is reduced to rubble. Emergency aid has to be sent to Gaza to rebuild Gaza. Then more arms are sold to Israel in this kind of constantly repeated cycle. And there is anxiety on Capitol Hill about that kind of continuing expenditure. So there's going to be some political battles to fight domestically for the Secretary of State and for President Biden in that regard.
Thanks for getting us up to speed. Simon Marks speaking to us from the US Capitol.